So, Mr. Bennett and Mrs Brown, Virginia Woolf's 1924 essay that sets out what we might call a manifesto for the new sort of fiction she wants to write, gave us the picture of Mrs Brown, this imaginary figure who has her seed, as it were, in the woman that Virginia Woolf sees on the train between Richmond and Waterloo. And she imagines filling up the railway car with the novelists of the Edwardian era, the major novelists, H.G. Wells, John Galsworthy, and Arnold Bennett, all of whom, for their skill as writers, somehow miss what's essential about Mrs. Brown, according to Virginia Woolf. They miss her consciousness, her inner essence. They miss her real character. Arnold Bennett talks about character being essential to fiction, but clearly he means something rather different by character from what Virginia Woolf means. Now, Virginia Woolf puts this down memorably to December 1910. In or about December 1910, human character changed. Well, it's a strange thing to say, I think, because if we think about human character changing at all, we surely think about it changing rather gradually, not in this sort of wholesale way. She says, all human relations have shifted, those between masters and servants, husbands and wives, parents and children. And when human relations change, there is at the same time a change in religion, conduct, politics, and literature. Let us agree to place one of these changes about the year 1910. Well, she seems to be backing off very slightly from her extravagant claim that we can date it to a single month in 1910 to December, but she clearly is pointing to some big, important sea change in what we think about people that dates from that period, what we think about people, their relation to the world, and the world that they live in. What is it? Well, what happens in 1910? Clearly, one thing she's talking about is social change. She's talking about, and this is her example, the difference in the relationship between masters and servants in this period. It's typical for Woolf that she adopts a fairly upper class or upper middle class perspective, and it would have been typical for even middle class families to have servants at this point in time. But things are starting to change. The Edwardian era on the surface is a relatively tranquil period coming after the long reign of Queen Victoria. We've got these 1901 to 1910. People often look back quite nostalgically to this period because it's a period before all the destruction of World War I. But things do change in this period, particularly at the end of it in 1910, when the Edwardian era comes to an end and we move into the Georgian era. One reason for that, I think, is the social changes that I mentioned before do start to happen from the top. We get the People's Budget, as it's called, and this passes through Parliament in 1910. And it really changes the tax structure of the British class system. So it begins to put in place a welfare state. It's the first sort of movement towards that. The upper classes are taxed more heavily, and the tax that brought in from the upper classes begin to fund things like pensions for old people, better education, better healthcare, and so on. And this does begin to alter the class structure of the country, and consequently it alters social life too. This is, I think, pretty much accelerated or exacerbated, brought into much more prominence, these changes by World War I. We might also think about, and Woolf doesn't mention this, but I think it's perhaps in the background of everything that's going on in the cultural changes at the time. We might mention the scientific breakthroughs of the early 20th century. Einstein, from a period from about 1905 onwards, is working on theories of relativity, and that really changes perceptions of what the world actually consists of. If we've assumed from the period of Newton, that the world can be understood. It's complex, but it's comprehensible, and there are no big gaps in our theories, and that sort of answers everything. Einstein really challenges that, and we begin to get some of the weird new physics of the 20th century coming into existence. As an intellectual, Virginia Woolf, I think, would have been aware of these changes. She wouldn't necessarily have read Einstein, I doubt she did, but she would have been aware of some of the implications. She's moving in very intellectual, thoughtful circles. Likewise, and perhaps the effect is more obvious here, the work of Sigmund Freud, which Virginia Woolf was closely associated with. Hogarth Press published a number of translations of Freud pretty early on. Freud in 1900 publishes The Interpretation of Dreams and begins to suggest the existence of the unconscious. We've seen some of this, some of the positive benefits of this coming through with the idea of the talking cure for victims of shell shock at the end of, or towards the end of World War I. But Freud really changes the idea of what human character might consist of, because it shows that human character is not just the rational ego making its way through the world, calculating and making decisions about the world. It emphasizes the importance of the unconscious, darker, eruptive, chaotic forces that actually make up the human psyche. And the human psyche is something that is continually at war with itself, between the different demands that we have from society and the demands of our instincts. We're continually at odds with ourselves. Likewise, at the same period, we have the introduction and the widespread reading of the philosophy of Henri Bergson. He's a French philosopher who was very interested in the ideas about time, and invited, writers and intellectuals found this particularly interesting, invited us to see time in a different way. Likewise, William James, who coined the phrase stream of consciousness, the psychological work that he does at the end of the 19th century is also starting to enter into the consciousness of a wide number of intellectuals at the time. Now, I think a key thing that Virginia Woolf is perhaps thinking of, that she doesn't mention directly, but it's often tied to this essay, is the post-impressionist exhibition, art exhibition of November 1910. Manet and the Post-Impressionists is an exhibition that is curated, designed and introduced by Roger Fry, who is part of Virginia Woolf's circle. This circle is called the Bloomsbury Group, after the area in London where they lived and tended to meet and converse, Bloomsbury in London. And Roger Fry was introducing these painters to the British public. It may seem strange to us now, but these painters were sort of very shocking and new and seen as transgressive and dangerous and insulting at the time that they were first introduced. We've got advanced artists like Wyndham Lewis, who wouldn't have learned perhaps very much new from this exhibition. He would have been familiar with this work already, but for the British public, this would have been a very shocking exhibition and a very important exhibition. So we have painters such as Cézanne. Here we can see one of a series of paintings he did of a mountain in the south of France, Mont Saint-Victoire. And you can see how he's moving away from a photographic style of representation to something that gives the colour almost its own freedom to mix and to harmonise. He's painting rocks and sky and forests, but he's doing it with these sort of intense brush strokes that give the colour an incredible luminosity that breaks away from naturalistic, quasi-photographic versions of realism. We've got Van Gogh. Here we've got a painting that's, very familiar. It's on perhaps, a number of people's bedroom walls. It's a poster these days, but it's Starry Night. And again, we can see this isn't what the scientific eye sees. It's what the inner eye sees. There's a tremendous energy of colour and form in this work. Everything seems to be alive with some sort of almost terrifying vitality. It reminds me, in the context that we're speaking of the way in which Septimus Smith sees the world. The world seems to be on the verge in this incredibly intense, terrifying way of falling to pieces, of tearing itself asunder and bursting into flames. Now, back to the writers. We've been told that Mr. Bennett has never once looked at Mrs. Brown in her corner. He perhaps has described the world that she lives in very acutely, but he hasn't engaged with what it is to be Mrs. Brown. Modern writing after 1910, Georgian writing as she sometimes calls it, shows a great deal of effort and strain as it tries to break through into new forms. She mentions James Joyce and T.S. Eliot. Joyce, she had read and admired Ulysses, though she had some reservations about it, and ultimately felt that it was a failure. And she had read T.S. Eliot's work very closely. She published T.S. Eliot with the Hogarth Press. She knew Eliot socially. He was on the fringes of the Bloomsbury Group. So she was very well aware of what these writers were doing. And she admires it, she's excited by it, but ultimately she feels it's not quite what she wants to do, and it's not quite successful in the terms that she's setting out. What is that? What terms is she setting out? Let's take this passage from the essay, Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown. In the course of your daily life this past week, you have had far stranger and more interesting experiences than the one I've tried to describe. You have overheard scraps of talk that filled you with amazement. You've overheard and gone to bed at night bewildered by the complexity of your feelings. In one day, thousands of ideas have coursed through your brains, thousands of emotions have met, collided, and disappeared in astonishing disorder. I want to link that to a passage in Mrs. Dalloway early in the novel where Mrs. Dalloway is walking about the streets of London. Let's take a passage from page 8. She would not say of anyone in the world now that they were this or were that. She felt very young, at the same time unspeakably aged. She sliced like a knife through everything, at the same time was outside looking on. She had a perpetual sense as she watched the taxicabs of being out, far out to sea and alone. She always had the feeling that it was very, very dangerous to live, even one day. That sense of intensity, the sense of experience going on beneath the surface. She appears to be just taking a tranquil walk around the streets of London, going to the flower shop to get flowers for her party. But think about the inner drama that Virginia Woolf is capturing. This is where she wants to put her emphasis. This is what the novel is going to be about. It's going to be about what goes on inside people, those feelings, how they feel connections to each other, how they feel utterly separate and desolate from each other. This intense drama is going on all the time inside all of us, Woolf thinks. And novelists up to this point have failed to capture this drama.